Hey class, what's up? For today's short lecture, we're going to talk about Seiter's semiotics, structuralism, and television. And along the way, I'm going to mix in a little bit of the Roland Barthes theory from Myth Today, the other reading that you should have done for this week. So let's go ahead and get started in our conversation about semiotics. So what we're doing here is we're taking a little bit of a sideline trip into the discussion of semiotics, which is itself uh, sort of a linguistic science, for lack of a better term. So you might have found some of this reading kind of dense, and you're not the only ones, right? One of my favorite quotes is this one at the top. It says, semiotics tells us the things we already know in a language that we will never understand. So, obviously, if you found this reading a little hard to interpret, you're not the only ones. Um, it has been difficult for many, but put simply, to make it as simple as possible, semiotics is the study of everything and anything that can be used for communication. So semiotics, again, can be used to study words, to study pictures, to study sign language, to study writing, drawing, again, anything that we use for communication. And what's interesting about semiotics and what makes it a little different from other forms of criticism is that it's concerned with how meaning is created rather than what the meaning is. So with semiotics, linguists are looking at systems of communication in order to figure out how we create meaning. Okay? So, to give you a little background about this, the field of semiotics is essentially invented. I'm making air quotes right now. You can't see me, but I'm making air quotes. So, it's essentially invented by two different scholars at roughly the same time. So the first one we look at is Charles Sanders Peirce. So he invented this form semiotics and wrote quite extensively on it. However, his work on semiotics didn't really gain favor until after his death. Now, the field was also invented by the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, who used the term semiology to describe this science in his famous work, The Course in General Linguistics. And here are the fellows. You can tell Peirce had an awesome beard, so I generally give him more credit just for that. So semiotics, then, in terms of what Seiter is writing about here, figures into a larger study or method of criticism way of thinking that's known as structuralism. So structuralism arises primarily out of sociology, but also can be found in anthropology, linguistics, and semiotics, right? And the idea behind structuralism is that elements of human culture have to be understood in terms of their relationship to a larger system or structure. So the idea here, I know I have a ton of words on the screen, but the idea here is that when we study structuralism, we're trying to uncover the structures that undergird all the things that we do, all the things that we think, perceive, and feel, right? So the philosopher Simon Blackburn describes structuralism as the belief that phenomena of human life are not intelligible except through their interrelations. So again, the idea here is that we can't study things on their own. That particularly when it comes to culture or society, all these things are linked together. And that to study one element of society or culture is to miss how these elements relate to others. And as these elements relate to other elements in our social community, right, or our social life, they create structures. And these structures are literally the structures of our society, of our culture, right? So what Seiter is doing here is she's telling you about semiotics so that you can understand how semiotics figures into structuralism, or rather the ways that these messages that we send one another are all interrelated with our culture and society in ways that help to form the very structure or the scaffolding that our culture is made out of, right? That it's built upon. So to understand semiotics, we have to understand the smallest unit of meaning. You'll see throughout the study of science that we're always interested in trying to sort of pare things down to their essential elements, their kernels, or their cores, right? And semiotics is no different. In physics, we try and pare things down to the atom, and now we're trying to pare things down even further to subatomic levels, right? So in semiotics, the atom, so to speak, is what we call the sign. This is the smallest unit of meaning in semiotics, right? And so the sign, as you can see here, is made up of two parts. Now we can separate these parts in theory, right? But in actual communication, you can't really break them down. So in semiotics, the smallest unit is the sign. And the sign is made up of two things, the signifier and the signified, right? So let's take a look at this in a practical example. So the signifier, right, is an image, object, or sound. So here, right, we can say that the signifier is the word tree. Right? So the tree is a sound. It's a signifier that's a sound, right? That represents the signified, which is that concept or that idea of a tree that appears in your mind when I say the word tree. And together, the word and this idea of the word, together, these things make a sign, right? So, I say tree. In your mind, you have this sort of image or idea of a tree. And together, those two things equal a sign. Now, it's important for me to point out that the word tree, right, the signifier, and the signified, right, neither of these things are the actual real things that you're referring to. Right? So this idea of a tree that you get in your mind is not the same thing as a real tree. It's just your idea of a tree, right? So the real thing is known as the referent, what you're referring to. In this case, a real tree. So one of the things that Saussure did that really made an impression on people and helped change the way we think about language is he stressed that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is completely arbitrary. So what he's saying here is that in essence, we all just got together and said, okay, so what is this? Well, it's, let's call it a child. And so we all just, at least in English, agreed to call this thing here a child, right? But that's essentially arbitrary. We just made it up and all agreed that that's the term that we would use. There's nothing inherently childish, right, or childlike about this child, right? And the way that we know that is that the word for child is different across the globe. So here, this child, who happens to be my son, by the way. So my son here is a child in English, but in German, he's a kind, right? In Italian, he's a bambino. In French, he's an enfant, right? We have all these different terms, and these show us, these let us know that these signifiers, right, these words that we use, aren't really physically, objectively related to these things. They're just arbitrary words that we've made up. And indeed, the word's meaning is essentially derived from its different from other words, right? Or its difference from other words. So again, there's nothing there's nothing about this child that necessitates that we call it a child, right? We could call it a kin, we could call it a bambino, we could call my son all these different kinds of things. It's just that we decided in English to call it a child. And so as a result, right, what really gives words their meanings is their difference from other words. So why is he a child? Because he's not a desk, because he's not a house, because he's not a dog, right? And so this is where Saussure says that the word's meaning truly comes from. And this is, in part, why it's difficult to learn a foreign language, right? Because these words, these terms, are arbitrary. They're made up. Otherwise, if there was something about my child that necessitated that he be called a child, it'd be easier to learn that in a different language. Because you look at him and say, oh yeah, child, it's got to be the same in French. But it's not. I realize these ideas are abstract and are somewhat hard to understand. But at their base, the key here really is that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is an arbitrary one, right? Meaning that it's sort of randomly assigned. Excuse me. So what I indicated earlier, again, is that Saussure bracketed off the real objects to which language refers as referents, right? So if we think again about the tree, right? The sign, the word tree, and your idea of a tree are different from an actual physical tree out in the yard. And that actual physical tree is a referent. It's what you're referring to. Now, semiotics doesn't really worry about reference. When we study semiotics, we're not necessarily worried about the objective reality of the world. We're interested in the signs, in this case, in language, right? And part of the reason why we're interested in language instead of the real things, the referents, is because some signs have no real object to which they refer. This is true about things like abstractions. Concepts like freedom or truth are both abstractions. You can't show me freedom. You can't show me truth, right? These are abstract notions, abstract ideas. And so it's not like a tree. There is no referent per se, right? There's no real object when we say freedom that we're referring to. So when we study semiotics, we have to be more worried about the signs than the referents. Because sometimes the things we're referring to are abstract concepts other than real things. Now, the other reason that we do this is because of what we call imagined referents. So I could talk about a mermaid or a unicorn, but these things have no reference. There is no such thing as a mermaid. There is no such thing as a unicorn, right? So again, when we study semiotics, we have to be worried about more than just the real objects, because we use language to talk about things that aren't real. Because we create meaning. This is part of the beauty of language, right? Because we're able to create meanings and convey information about things that literally don't exist, as well as abstractions, abstract ideas, ideals, theories, ideologies, right? And this is what makes language so tremendously powerful, right? And then, just for the record, by the way, I should also point out that signs that we use to describe other signs are called interpretants. Now, that's just a little extra that I threw in there, not something you really have to concern yourself with for the nature of, or for the purposes of this class. So that's Saussure. Now let's talk a little bit about Charles Sanders Peirce and how Peirce figures into semiotics and structuralism. So Peirce is very well known because he took signifiers, right, and arranged them into three different types. He categorized them. So Peirce took signifiers and made three different categories: icons, symbols, and indices. So let's go through each one briefly. So the icon, right, if a signifier is an icon, then it has a resemblance to its signified. It looks like the thing it's describing. Now, this operates on a sliding scale. It may look a lot like the thing it's describing or a little bit, right? But nevertheless, there's a resemblance there. So a painting, like a portrait painting, for example, right, would be an icon. Jesus on the cross in a church is an icon, right? It has a resemblance to the signified. Now, a symbol is different. For Peirce, a symbol doesn't look, sound, or smell like what it's describing. An example of a symbol would be a spoken word. So I say tree. Well, the word tree doesn't look, sound, or smell, or taste anything like what it's describing. So that's a symbol, right? It's a signifier that we use to describe something that is nothing like the signifier itself. And then finally, there are indices, which is the plural of index. So an index, right, is a signifier that bears a physical connection to the thing that it represents. So a smell, for example, is an index. Another example would be smoke, right? There is no smoke without fire. So smoke bears an indexical relationship to fire. It has a physical connection to it, right? So here are some examples. Over here, right, we have icons. So here we have a badger of some sort, right? We have these drawings of various things, but these are icons, right? They merely resemble the things that we're talking about, right? Now, over here, we have indices, right? Or things that have indexical relationships. So, for example, this picture of a tree or this picture of the Eiffel Tower, right? A picture is ultimately a image that is created by light bouncing off of an object, physically bouncing off of an object, and striking, well, in traditional photography at least, photosensitive film. So it is leaving an impression, right? Much like a footprint. So the footprint in the sand is an index. A photograph is an index because it's got the physical light bouncing off of the subject that's hitting the film, and it creates an index, right? And then finally we have symbols. Again, things like words, right? Things like flags that can represent whole nations or ideas, right? These are symbols. All right, so then let's take a look at some of these and think about what these images are. So here we'll start with the hot dog, right? With the dachshund, the wiener dog. So the wiener dog that we see here is an icon, right? It looks like the thing it represents. Here we have a footprint on the moon, right? From the first landing on the moon. Well, this footprint is an index because it bears a physical connection to the thing that it signifies, the astronaut, right? Here, the Nike swoosh is a symbol, right? It's a symbol. It doesn't look anything really like what it represents, and it bears no physical relationship to that thing. Here, interestingly, right, this is what's known as a death mask, right? It's Abraham Lincoln's death mask. So this is an index, right? It's an index because these are made by actually pouring plaster over the dead person's face and creating an impression of their face in plaster, right? So it's got a physical relationship to Abraham Lincoln, the thing it represents. So it's an index, right? Here, the Apple logo, if you've been following along, right? You know this is an icon, right? Because it looks like an apple, right? Here we have, again, we've seen this before from this is the famous painting, The Treachery of Images. This is not a pipe, right? That's right, it's not a pipe, it's an icon. It's a representative image of a pipe, right? Here, right, the sex symbol, right? Again, we know this to be what? That's right, everybody say it at once, right? It is a symbol. It doesn't look, smell, taste like the thing that it represents. So one of the things that's interesting about Peirce's model of semiotics is that it doesn't require intention to communicate, right? Signs can be produced by non-human agencies or unconscious senders. So this is in line with the modern theory of communication, in which we understand that you're always communicating, right? People are always communicating whether or not they intend to or not, right? And so Peirce, in a sense, takes this a step further and says, well, things can communicate to us, right, without intending to communicate. So here's an example, right, with the compass. So the compass is communicating. The compass has no will or agency. It doesn't sit down and say, well, I'm going to point north now, right? But the compass still communicates. So Peirce says, listen, we got to understand that signs oftentimes work without intention, that they create meaning without intending to, right? But at the same time, signification can't take place outside of human communication, right? So there's got to be a human there to interpret the compass, is what Peirce is saying, right? And at the same time, we can't really promise that all receivers will agree on the relationship of signifier to signified. So in other words, some people may interpret the message differently. This goes back to Stuart Hall and his idea of how people read things differently. Negotiated, dominant, and resistant readings, right? So as a result of all this, authorial intention is not included in the study of signs, and neither is the interpretation or reception of the message. I realize this seems strange, but what we're doing when we're studying semiotics is, right, we're talking about the creation of meaning, not the interpretation of meaning, not the intention behind the creation of meaning, rather how meaning is created in and of itself. It's, in this sense, it's a scientific attempt, right? We're trying to, Peirce is trying to eliminate all the variables. And he says, listen, it doesn't matter what the intention is. It doesn't really matter what the interpretation is. We want to study the meaning in and of itself objectively, right? So then the question becomes, how does all of this fanciness relate to media, right? This is a media theory course after all. And so one of the ways it relates to media is in the consideration of what we call the ontology of the media, right? So ontology is a philosophical study of the essence or nature of being, becoming, existence, or reality, as well as the basic categories of being and their relations. So famously, there's a famous essay that you might have come across in your studies today called The Ontology of the Photographic Image. And in this essay, what the author is trying to get at, when the author is talking about the ontology of the image, is what's the essence of the photographic image? He asks, how should we understand the essence or the ontology of the photographic images that we see? Do these images tell the truth? Meaning, do they have an indexical relationship to things? When you film something, when you film reality, is that the truth? Right? I mean, we've all heard the phrase, the camera never lies, right? And if we look at photographs as indexical relationships, then we understand that they're capturing some of the physicality of the real thing. Now, of course, we talked about Stuart Hall a week ago, and Hall says, listen, as soon as we break down the image into discourse of any kind, right, it's no longer the real thing anymore, like the Twin Towers. It becomes the planes hitting the towers become a story, and that's not the same as the real thing, right? But nevertheless, many TV images that we see, particularly on the news, are produced in such a way that we're encouraged to understand them as indexical signs, as representative of reality. And so this creates a debate, right? And semiotics is the key to this debate. When we see news footage of the Twin Towers, is this an indexical message? Is it a message, that's captured reality? Or is this an iconic message? A message that simply resembles the reality, right? And I don't have an answer for this, and I don't expect you to either. But this is the kind of thing that media theorists think about, right? And they wonder if the news presents itself as indexical, as representing reality, as showing you what really happened, is this a problem? Right? Is it a problem? Is it really real? Or is it just iconic? So these are some interesting questions. And these are, of course, questions that documentary filmmakers deal with all the time. Are they documenting, as the genre name would imply, are they documenting reality? Or are they just presenting a story? And so the famous documentarian Errol Morris, very well known for films like The Fog of War, for example, what Errol Morris, well, here's what he has to say about it. We'll watch a little bit of this.
Most people write about photographs as cultural icons of one sort or another. What we've forgotten, I could be wrong about this, my hunch is what we've forgotten is that photographs are connected to the physical world. I've done something very, very simple, but I don't really see it that often, is I've tried to recover that connection between a photograph and the world. It's not what I believe about the photograph. It's not about what I think I see in the photograph. It's a true investigation into the world in which the photograph was taken. My book, Believing is Seeing, starts with two photographs from 1855 from the Crimean War. A British photographer, considered by many to be the first war photographer, Roger Fenton, was sent to the Crimea, took many, many, many photographs. This pair of photographs are his two most famous, called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. This valley was named by British soldiers because this was trench warfare people lobbing cannonballs at each other. And here we see this barren landscape covered with cannonballs. And this is the beginning of my inquiry. The question is, which of them came first? There's really no indication that one photograph came before the other. They're identical, virtually identical, except in one, there are cannonballs on this road that bisects the picture, and the other, there are no cannonballs. And so it becomes an issue of posing. Did Fenton deliberately put the cannonballs on the road in order to pose this picture? What makes an honest photograph? What makes a truthful photograph? We've all heard endless arguments about how photographs should be taken. There are journalistic debates. Photographs shouldn't be posed. The photographer should touch nothing. They should observe at a distance. I have a slightly different view. Photographs are neither true nor false. Talking about the truth or falsity of a photograph is nonsense talk.
That's probably a good place to stop Errol Morris. So what Errol Morris is concerned with here, right, is his documentary that he's talking about focuses on these two different pictures of this road. In one, it's littered with cannonballs. In the other, it's not. And he's wondering which one is more accurate in a sense, right? And sets out to investigate this. And along the way, in terms of the investigation, he deals with these questions of, right, this question of how true, in quotation marks, is the photograph, right? What is the ontology of the photographic image? Does it represent reality? Does it represent objective reality? And here, then, he begins talking about things like posing, right? About interfering with the image in a way, right? So that it doesn't really represent reality anymore. And this leads him eventually to this idea that he just vocalized, which is to talk about the truth or the falsity of a picture, of a photograph, is nonsense, right? Because in his study of the ontology of the image, its connection to reality is almost unimportant, right? So he doesn't view it as with this same kind of view that we might of the index somehow being linked to truth, right? I would suggest that Morris seems to say that there's always more of a kind of iconic relationship at play. So this relates to one of the important insights from semiotics, and that is that all forms of communication, right? All communication is partial, motivated, conventional, and biased. So even forms like print journalism that are founded on the idea of truth-seeking and reliability, and in theory, it used to be at least a notion of impartiality, right? Impartiality can never really be achieved. And this goes back to that notion of Stuart Hall and the planes hitting the towers. And as the commentators on the news are trying to convert the reality into a story, right, it becomes biased in a way. Right? Even the act of filming the planes hitting the tower makes it biased in a way, because it's impossible to film it from every angle. Right? It's impossible to understand it in its reality. You see. Because even if we see it in the real world, even if we're standing there at the bottom of the tower looking up and we see the plane hit the tower, we're only seeing it from one angle. We can never really understand the totality of the whole thing. So right away, it's biased because it's from our viewpoint. And as soon as we try and vocalize our viewpoint, and say it to someone else, or draw it for someone else, or film it for someone else, right? We turn it into discourse, and it becomes even more biased at that point, right? Because it gets further away from that reality that we could never really reach in the first place. It's kind of depressing in a way, right? So this all brings us up to the point in Seiter's chapter here where she discusses the difference between denotation and connotation and how that relates to the signs that we see, right? This also is where the reading from Barthes on Barthes' mythology, rather, and Seiter intersect. And so to get right down to it, the difference between denotation and connotation is that denotation, right, is the first order of signification, right? So the signifier is the image itself, and the signified is the idea or concept. This is that most basic idea of the sign. And so when we're talking about denotation and a picture, for example, to answer what does it denote is to answer what is it a picture of. So if I show you a picture of a little girl, right, it denotes a little girl. It's a picture of a little girl. But connotation is the second order signifying system. It's another level of signification that builds off the first, right? And it attaches additional meaning. So if I show you, for example, a picture of a police officer in today's environment, let's say. I show you a picture of a police officer, and I ask you, what does it denote? Oh, well, it's a picture of a police officer, and that's easy. But then where things become more complicated is at the level of connotation. What does the picture connote? Well, policemen are controversial figures in our society today, right? Some of you might look at it and say oppression, violence. Others might look at it and say law and order, justice, right? These ideas are abstract ideas that operate on the connotative level. On the next level, yeah, it's on a denotative level, it's just a picture of a cop. But on the connotative level, it could be an oppressor, it could be a savior, it could be a first responder, it could be all these different things, right? And connotation then functions on the level of ideology, right? This level of ideas. And this is what Barthes is talking about, right? So when Barthes describes picking up the magazine with the young black youth saluting, African youth saluting the French flag, well, what he's talking about there is that what the photograph denotes is very clear, right? It's a young African child saluting the French flag. But on the connotative level, it means all kinds of other things, right? It could stand for colonialism. It could stand for post-colonialism. It could stand for the glory of the French Empire, of the French flag. It could, right? It's got all these meanings attached to it that operate on a kind of a secondary level. And that secondary level is the level of ideology. And so that's what Barthes is really examining in his piece on myth. He's examining connotation. He's looking around at a variety of signs in culture and then talking about their connotative meanings, right? In each of these, he's talking about the meaning or the idea, the feeling that these things invoke in addition to their literal meanings, right? The extra bits. So again, another example, someone dressed in KKK robes, right? A man dressed in KKK robes. We can look at that and say, what does this picture denote? Well, it denotes a man in robes. But on a connotative level, right, the meaning is much more sinister and profound, right? Oh, well, it connotes racism, it connotes white supremacy, right? All these kinds of things. Right? So this is the difference between denotation and connotation. And what Barthes is interested in, the reading you did for this week, is examining connotation. Because connotation is the language of ideology, and ideology is the language of myth, right? Which is why he entitles his piece Myth Today. Here are some additional examples, right, that we could look at in terms of connotation and denotation. So the Boy Scout, right? Well, on a very basic level, this is a picture of a boy with his hand raised, saluting, right? But that's the denotative level. But on the connotative level, well, this is about duty, God, country, honesty, forthrightness, honor, right? All these concepts. Here, right, from this magazine cover, we see this young woman eating a popsicle. That's the denotative meaning of this picture. But on a connotative level, I suggest it means something quite different. Here with Wall Street, right? What is this on the denotative level? Well, it's a picture of a sign that says Wall Street. But on the connotative level, it means all kinds of things, doesn't it? Finance, wealth, power, all the things that we traditionally, capitalism, all finance, all the things that we associate with Wall Street, right? And so these images, right, and the level of connotation, they're saying things that are quite different than what they denote, that have additional meanings that go well beyond whatever you're being presented with in the picture. And this, for Barthes, is the realm, again, of myth and ideology, right? And so Barthes says, connotation is the central way in which mass media communicates its ideological meanings. And it does this in the form of myth, right? And so he talks about the Challenger, the space shuttle that blew up, right? So he's not really interested in the fact that the space shuttle took off and then blew up. That's the denotative meaning. That's what we get, right? But what's much more interesting for Barthes is the connotative meanings behind all this, right? The Challenger, the shuttle itself, stood for scientific progress. This idea of American manifest destiny in space, that we're meant to explore it, right? That we're winning the space race at the time against the Russians. And then the Challenger disaster, the fact that this particular space shuttle blew up, destabilized, right? The explosion destabilizes a lot of these myths that were associated with the Challenger. And so we see, right, all of a sudden that science can fail, right? That this thing, instead of being part of our manifest destiny, was simply a waste of life, right? That instead of winning the space race, what we're doing is sacrificing human lives to technocracy, right? You see how much more interesting these ideas are and how much more profound and complicated and intricate they are than the denotative meanings of the stories themselves, right? Of the pictures. This is where the wealth of communication comes from, is this connotative level. So what he's saying here, in part, with the Challenger, right, references back to the work of Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, who distinguished between things being what he called present at hand or ready to hand. And he says, that things generally present themselves as ready to hand. This is the way we encounter things in the world. And as such, they're kind of invisible to us. So a hammer, for example, you don't spend a lot of time thinking about a hammer. You get it, you use it, you're done, right? You don't really consider the hammer until it breaks. And when the hammer breaks, it becomes present at hand, right? Its presence at hand at that point is foregrounded. That is, we become aware of the tool itself rather than the job. We see, if you want to know what something is good for, if you want to understand its ontology, so to speak, its essence, the best way to understand that ontology is for it to break. because then suddenly we're forced to deal with it. We're forced to look at it and say, what the fuck? It's broken. I can't use this anymore. And so the use of the hammer for driving nails, for example, becomes readily apparent when you can't use it to do that. But as long as it works, as long as it does its job, you don't even notice it. Right? So what Heidegger is saying is that when these things break, they become present at hand, and that's when we realize what they're actually good for, what they do. And in a sense, this is what Barthes is arguing about the Challenger blowing up. Is that when it blows up, we see, oh shit, look at all these other connotative meanings now that are associated with this thing. And look how it lays bare the connotative meanings that were associated with it before it blew up, that we weren't even really thinking about critically. Right? I mean, this is, in a sense, a fancy way of talking about you don't know what you have till you lose it. Right? You know, you date somebody and then you break up and you look back, oh man, you know, I really miss them. Well, at the time you didn't miss them. It's only when you break up that you miss them and you realize perhaps their positive attributes, when they become present at hand, when your relationship is broken. Right? And so this is an interesting way to think about the stories and the communications and all the things that are being sent out to us by our media, right? I'm sure you've heard people discussing whether or not the media today is broken, quote unquote. So if it is, if it's broken, has become present at hand, can we look at it and figure out what the hell it was meant to do? Can we become aware of the media as a tool or as tools? It's an interesting question. Right? So then Seiter goes on from there and she talks about METs and METs 5 channels of communication. I'm not going to cover this a lot, right? But METs, it is a somewhat interesting idea, right? So MET says there are 5 channels of communication: images, written language, graphics, voice, music, or sound effects, right? And so, because Seiter is writing about television, she notes that television has a tendency to use all these together. But then she goes on and she says, but interestingly, when we think about divisions between high and low art, something that we've talked about already in this class, when we think about divisions between high and low art, it's interesting because the number of channels utilized seems to speak to this. The more channels that are used, the lower the art form. Think about it. Painting, for example, high art, what does it use? Just one, right? Image. Poetry, high art, right? What does it use? Just one channel, written language, right? Opera, voice. And to some extent, voice and image, right? So you see that in a sense, part of the reason, what Seiter is saying here is that part of the reason we tend to look down on television is because it tends to use all these things. And so this is an interesting thing to be aware of, right? When you yourself consider things and whether or not they're high or low art. This brings us to her relatively brief discussion of syntagms and paradigms. So to understand this, and again, this is, so to speak, this won't be on the test. Not that there's a test, you're writing a paper, but it's not that important you understand it. But I still want to go over it a little bit, just so you understand what the hell you read. So a syntagm is an ordering of signs, a rule-governed combination of signs in a determined sequence, whereas a paradigm is a group of signs that are so similar that they essentially could be substituted for one another in a syntagm. So, paradigms, then, are used to construct syntagmatic change. So, what does this mean? Well, a syntagm, again, is an ordering of signs, like a sentence or a menu, right? A paradigm is a group of signs that make up a syntagm. So the words in a sentence, the items on a menu, right? So the syntagm is the ordering, right? Subject, verb, right? And paradigm are the words, let's say. So paradigmatic associations are synchronic, right? So we group the signs together as if they have no history or temporal order, whereas syntagmatic relationships tend to be diachronic. That is, they unfold over time. So here, for example, right, this is a diachronic representation of popular sitcoms over time, right? It's diachronic because they unfold over time between 1950 and 2010. But all these shows bear a paradigmatic association because they make up, right? They're the things that compose this all, and they're all sitcoms. Hopefully that makes sense. And the reason that Seiter goes over these things is ultimately to get you to Lang and Parole. So this is a Saussurian idea, right? And the idea here is that Lang is an entire system of communication. So Lang, for example, might be English, the English language, right? And parole are individual utterances in that language. So here, I get kind of funny. Go fuck yourself, right, is an example of parole. It's an arrangement of the English language. So English is a system. Go F yourself is an individual utterance, right? And so Lang, the total sign system, can be inferred from studying parole, the individual utterances or signs. So, this is how, for example, if we're able to figure out hieroglyphics, right? If we could figure out one phrase or one, line of hieroglyphics, then we can use that to figure out the whole system, right? If we can decode part of a message, we could use the part we decoded to figure out the whole system. The system is Lang. The part that we decoded to begin with is parole. And parole could be used to figure out Lang, to figure out the whole system. All right, well, that's it for this unit. I know it was very abstract and very philosophical, but semiotics really lies at the heart of much of what we do in communications and is probably the most scientific attempt we've made to understand the creation of meaning in the history of Western studies. All right, well, thanks for checking out my video. I hope you learned something, and I will talk to you again next week.